The pills that would one day kill Elvis Presley were not first offered to him in the neon glare of Las Vegas. They were not slid across a polished bar by a shadowy doctor. Nor were they a gift from the Hollywood machine that chewed up stars and spat them out. The first pills were placed in his hand by a uniformed sergeant of the United States Army under the cold, gray skies of West Germany. Was this an act of military necessity? A simple tool to keep a soldier sharp on a freezing night? Or was it the first silent shot fired in the 2-year assassination of Elvis Presley's soul? The year was 1958. The world did not simply know the name Elvis Presley. It vibrated with it. He was a force of nature, a cultural earthquake who had redrawn the map of popular music with a sneer and a swivel of his hips. He was more than a singer. He was an idea, a rebellion wrapped in black leather, the living embodiment of a generation's untamed spirit. From his throne at Graceland, he was untouchable, a king reigning over an empire of vinyl and celluloid. But empires fall, and sometimes the weapon that brings them down is not a sword, but a single sheet of paper. The draft notice arrived like a death warrant for the life he knew. The United States government had called his number, and in doing so, it aimed to tame the earthquake, to put the rebellion in a uniform, to turn the king into a grunt. Serial number 53310-761. He was no longer a name. He was a number. The world held its breath. Pundits and preachers alike declared his career over. How could this wild, singular energy survive the rigid conformity of military life? Colonel Tom Parker, the carnival barker who masqueraded as his manager, saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. A 2-year, government-funded public relations campaign. But even the colonel, for all his cunning, could not see the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The shearing was a public spectacle, a ritual sacrifice. As the famous raven hair fell to the barbershop floor, it was as if they were cutting away the very source of his power, stripping him of his crown and his identity in front of the entire world. He played the part, smiling for the cameras, a humble patriot doing his duty. But behind the eyes, a different story was being written. The story of a man being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. He was shipped off to Fort Hood for basic training, the Texas sun a merciless eye in the sky. But the real war, the one that would define the rest of his life, would not be fought there. It would be fought in the dense, dark forests of West Germany, on the front lines of the Cold War. This is where the story truly changes. Because while the world saw a hero in the making, a secret was being buried. The Army, recognizing the monumental public relations coup they had in Private Presley, made him an offer. A way out. He could join the Special Services, the military's entertainment branch. He could spend his 2 years with a guitar in his hands instead of a rifle, living in comfortable private quarters, performing for the troops. He would be safe. He would be a star in uniform. He refused. In a move that stunned the top brass, Elvis insisted on being a regular soldier. He didn't want special treatment. He wanted to drive a tank, to pull guard duty, to be one of the men. He wanted to prove to his country, to his family, and perhaps most of all, to himself, that he was more than just the caricature on the album covers. It was a decision born of pride and a deep-seated need for authenticity, and it was the decision that sealed his fate. By choosing the path of the common soldier, he walked directly into the trap that had been set for him, not by an enemy, but by the very system he had sworn to serve. Friedberg, Germany, a drab, colorless town that felt 1,000 light-years from the vibrant chaos of Memphis. The barracks were cold, the discipline was absolute, and the loneliness was a physical presence, a constant, heavy cloak. His mother, Gladys, the anchor of his entire world, had died just weeks before he was deployed. He had been granted emergency leave to attend her funeral, a harrowing ordeal that saw him collapse in grief over her coffin. He returned to the army, a hollowed-out shell of himself, adrift in a sea of sorrow, half a world away from anyone who truly understood him. The king was now an orphan, and the nights in Germany were long and dark. He threw himself into his duties with a desperate intensity. He was assigned to the 1st Medium Tank Battalion, 32nd Armor. His job was to be a scout, a driver for Company D's commander. It was grueling work. The days were long, but the nights were worse. Endless maneuvers in the biting cold of the Fulda Gap, a strategic stretch of land where everyone believed World War III would begin. They would stay awake for days at a time, their bodies pushed to the absolute limit, their minds blurred with exhaustion. The cold was a constant enemy, seeping into their bones. The fatigue was a poison, dulling their senses, making them slow, making them vulnerable. In the tense standoff of the Cold War, a tired soldier was a dead soldier. The army knew this, and they had a solution: a little white pill. The man who made the introduction was a sergeant, a man Elvis looked up to. He saw the young private, the biggest star on the planet, shivering in the German mud, his eyelids heavy, struggling to stay on his feet after 48 hours without sleep. He approached him not with malice, but with what seemed like genuine concern, an act of battlefield camaraderie. He held out his hand. In his palm were 2 tablets. "These will help you," the sergeant said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "They'll keep you awake. The whole platoon uses them." He didn't call it a drug. He called it a pep pill. A wake-up. It was presented as just another piece of standard-issue equipment, as essential as a helmet or a pair of boots. Elvis hesitated. Back home, he didn't even drink. He was famously, almost puritanically, clean living. But this wasn't back home. This was a frozen field in a foreign country, and his body was screaming for relief. This wasn't a party. It was about survival. It was about being a good soldier. He took the pills. The effect was immediate, and it was miraculous. Within minutes, the crushing weight of fatigue vanished. The cold seemed to recede. A surge of pure, clean energy coursed through him, a feeling of power and clarity unlike anything he had ever known. His mind became a razor's edge. He was alert, focused, invincible. He could drive all night. He could stand guard until dawn. He could do anything they asked of him. He could be the perfect soldier. It felt like salvation. It was, in fact, a covenant with a devil he would never defeat. And while this chemical transformation was taking place in the darkness of the German forests, Colonel Parker was executing a masterstroke of publicity back in the United States. He had prepared for the 2-year absence, stockpiling unreleased recordings. A steady stream of #1 hits, "A Big Hunk O' Love," "Stuck on You," kept Elvis's voice on the radio, his name on the charts. The colonel flooded the press with carefully curated photographs. Elvis, smiling in his uniform. Elvis, humbly shaking hands with his superiors. Elvis, a model of patriotic duty. The American public consumed the myth wholesale. They saw a young man sacrificing his fame for his country, a hero who was both a king and a common man. The rebellion was gone, replaced by a sanitized, all-American icon. The man was breaking, but the myth had never been stronger. No one knew that the perfect soldier they were celebrating was being kept on his feet by government-issue amphetamines. The pills became a ritual. Before every long maneuver, before every sleepless night on guard duty, the sergeant would be there. They weren't a secret. They were a tool. Elvis saw other soldiers taking them, good soldiers, and it normalized the act. He started to rely on them. Then he started to look forward to them. For a man whose entire life had been a whirlwind of external pressures, of schedules, contracts, and the crushing weight of fame, this was a new kind of control. He couldn't control the army, he couldn't control his grief, but he could control the chemistry of his own mind. He could swallow a pill and command his body to obey. It was the most dangerous kind of power. After months in the barracks, he was finally allowed to live off base. He rented a large house at 14 Goethestrasse, in the spa town of Bad Nauheim, a place for the wealthy and the convalescing. He brought his father, his grandmother, and a few members of his Memphis mafia over from home, desperate to build a fortress against his loneliness, a small replica of Graceland in the heart of Germany. But he brought the pills with him. The house became a strange, dual reality. By day he would leave for the base, a disciplined soldier going to work. He became obsessed with karate, training relentlessly with a German Shotokan master named Jürgen Seidel. The amphetamines fueled these sessions, allowing him to push his body for hours on end, chasing a black belt with the same ferocious dedication he once reserved for his music. It was a quest for control, for a discipline that could conquer the chaos he felt inside. But by night, the soldier would disappear, and the restless king would emerge. The house on Goethestrasse became a nocturnal kingdom. Fueled by the pep pills that kept him from sleeping, Elvis and his entourage would turn night into day. They would watch movies, stage elaborate practical jokes, and talk for hours, trying to keep the silence and the sorrow at bay. The pills that were meant for military alertness had now become recreational fuel, the key to unlocking a world without the need for sleep. It was in this strange, insular world that a new face appeared, a face of impossible youth and innocence. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu, the 14-year-old stepdaughter of an Air Force captain stationed nearby. She was introduced to Elvis by a mutual friend, brought to the house on a weekend night like a tribute being delivered to a lonely monarch. He was captivated by her. She was a piece of home, an echo of the innocence he felt he had lost. He saw in her a blank slate, someone he could mold, someone who hadn't been tainted by the world he inhabited. Their courtship was a bizarre fairy tale, conducted under the watchful eyes of her parents and his inner circle. He would play her his new songs, tell her his fears, his dreams. To her, he was not the global icon, but a vulnerable, lonely boy. To him, she was a symbol of purity in an increasingly dark and complicated life. But even her presence, this fragile beacon of light, could not penetrate the chemical fog that was beginning to descend upon him. The dependency was no longer just for maneuvers. It was for everything. It was for getting through the day. It was for facing the fans who gathered at his gate. It was for dealing with the endless boredom and the gnawing grief that never truly left him. He and the guys in his circle developed a lexicon of code words. The pills were Dexies, or diet pills. Taking them was getting wired. It was a secret language for a secret war. The enemy was no longer the Soviet threat across the border. The enemy was exhaustion. It was sadness. It was sleep itself. One night, during a late winter field exercise, the illusion of control began to crack. The snow was falling thick and fast, a blinding white curtain that turned the German forest into a frozen labyrinth. They had been on alert for over 60 hours. The cold was brutal, a physical pain that made every breath an agony. Men were collapsing from sheer exhaustion, their bodies giving out. Elvis, driving his commander's jeep, was fighting a losing battle with sleep, his head nodding, the vehicle swerving dangerously on the icy path. He was a liability. He knew it. His sergeant knew it. The jeep pulled to a halt in the relative shelter of a thicket of pines. The sergeant leaned over, his voice a harsh whisper over the howling wind. "Presley," he barked, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "You're no good to us like this. You need to get your head straight, now." His glove-clad hand emerged from his pocket, holding not 2, but 4 of the little white pills. It wasn't an offer this time. It felt like an order. He took them. 4 little tablets of government-approved endurance. He felt the familiar, bitter chalk dissolve on his tongue. And then, he waited. The change was not instantaneous. It was a slow tide rising against the shore of his exhaustion. First, a warmth in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Jeep's failing heater. Then, a sharpening of the edges. The swirling snow outside began to resolve into individual flakes. The drone of the engine became a distinct, analyzable hum. The crushing weight on his eyelids simply lifted. His mind, which seconds before had been a swamp of fatigue, was now a pristine, well-lit command center. Every detail was sharp, every potential danger calculated. He put the Jeep in gear, his movements precise and economical. He was no longer just Elvis Presley, the tired boy from Tupelo. He was Sergeant Presley, an efficient, tireless component of the U.S. war machine, a perfect soldier, forged in chemistry. But was this really where the story of his addiction began? In the frozen forests of West Germany? In the gloved hand of a desperate sergeant? We think we know this story. But what if the seeds of this dependency weren't planted in the ice and snow? What if they were planted years earlier, in the sweltering humidity of a Memphis summer, in the one place he felt safest in the world, in the hands of his own mother? Gladys Presley loved her son with a consuming, ferocious intensity. And she suffered. She suffered from anxiety, from depression, from the dizzying dislocation of being a poor countrywoman suddenly living in a mansion. In the 1950s, for a woman like Gladys, there was a simple, medical solution for that kind of suffering. It came in a little brown bottle. They were called diet pills, or nerve pills. They were amphetamines. Elvis would have seen it. A young boy, devoted to his mother, watching her take her medicine to feel better, to get through the day. He wouldn't have understood the chemistry, but he would have understood the result. The pill made Mama feel good. The pill helped. The connection would have been forged deep in his subconscious, long before he ever wore a uniform. These little tablets weren't dangerous drugs. They were helpers. They were medicine, a solution to a problem. So now, here he was, a world away from home, using the same class of medicine his mother had used. She took it to quiet the storm inside her. He was taking it to survive a literal one. He was numbing the grief he felt for her with a chemical that was a direct echo of her own private struggle. He was fighting his war with her weapons. Did he ever make that connection? Did he ever look at the pill in his hand and see his mother's ghost? We can't know. But the tragic irony is inescapable. This internal conflict manifested itself physically. His obsession with karate wasn't just about self-defense. It was a desperate search for an opposing force. He was trying to conquer the chemical chaos with physical discipline. He would spend hours in the dojo, fueled by amphetamines, pushing his body to the brink, trying to achieve a state of mental clarity and control that the pills only mimicked. He was trying to become a warrior, to build a fortress of muscle and technique that could withstand the siege happening within his own mind. He read books on spirituality, on Eastern philosophy, searching for an answer, for a path. He was a man split in two, one half seeking enlightenment, the other willingly descending into a chemical haze. Then, in March 1960, it was over. Sergeant Presley was honorably discharged. He came home a hero. The world saw the same handsome boy who had left 2 years earlier, now with the added gravitas of a soldier. He looked disciplined. He looked strong. He looked ready to reclaim his throne. But the man who came home was not the man who had left. He was bringing back more than souvenirs and a black belt. He was bringing back a secret, a well-entrenched, chemically reinforced habit that had become essential to his daily functioning. And Colonel Parker was ready. There was no time for debriefing, no time for readjustment to civilian life. The schedule was relentless. A television special with Frank Sinatra to reintroduce him to the world. A new album, Elvis is Back, to be recorded immediately. And then, movies. A long, lucrative, and artistically stifling string of Hollywood pictures. The pressure was immense. The boy who had been a soldier was now, once again, a product. And a product needs to perform on schedule. How could any man keep up with that pace? The answer was simple. The answer was the same one the Army had given him. If you need to stay awake, if you need to perform, if you need to be on, there's a pill for that. The source just changed. It was no longer a military sergeant in a freezing Jeep. Now it was a compliant doctor in Beverly Hills, the infamous drive, feel-good types who catered to the stars. His addiction wasn't just his secret anymore. It became an open secret, enabled and supplied by the very system that was cashing in on his image as an all-American icon. The dissonance was staggering. To the world, Elvis was living a technicolor dream. He was singing on beaches in Hawaii, racing cars in Las Vegas, flying helicopters in paradise. He was the clean-cut hero in a series of frothy, forgettable films that solidified his image as safe, family-friendly entertainment. He was the fantasy, but the fantasy was only sustainable from 9 to 5. After the cameras stopped rolling, the other life would begin. The nights in his Bel Air mansion became a mirror image of the ones in Germany, only now with more money, more sycophants, and a more sophisticated pharmacy. The Memphis Mafia, his band of loyal friends and bodyguards, were no longer just companions. Their roles evolved. They became his gatekeepers, his protectors, and, tragically, his enablers. Their job was to create a bubble where the king's reality was the only reality. A world where night was day, where sleep was an enemy to be defeated, and where the pills were as plentiful as the Coca-Cola. It started as a simple equation. An amphetamine to get up and get to the studio, a barbiturate to come down and get to sleep. But the body is a stubborn thing. It builds a tolerance. The doses had to get higher. The uppers made him agitated and paranoid. The downers left him groggy and slow. So new pills were added to the cocktail. Pills to counteract the side effects of the other pills. His life was no longer governed by the sun or the clock, but by a complex, self-devised pharmaceutical schedule. It was a chemical prison being built, brick by brick, with prescriptions. He had everything a man could possibly dream of. Fame beyond measure, wealth beyond imagination. He was adored by millions. Yet, he was becoming more and more isolated, a prisoner in his own gilded cage. The world outside his bubble was a threat. The only people he trusted were the ones inside, the ones who shared his secret and lived by his nocturnal rules. Was he the master of this strange kingdom he had built? Or was he already its first and most helpless captive? The line had begun to blur, and with every pill he swallowed, it was fading a little more. And it was in this fading light, this self-imposed twilight, that a stranger, more profound motivation began to take hold. Because what if the pills weren't just a prison? What if, in his distorted reality, he believed they were also a key to a door he was desperate to unlock? We think we know the story. The uppers to perform, the downers to rest. But that's only the surface. That was the Hollywood Elvis. The real Elvis, the man who stayed up for days on end, wasn't just avoiding sleep. He was chasing something. He devoured books on religion, the occult, numerology, and life after death. He was on a frantic, obsessive spiritual quest. He was trying to find God, to understand his own bizarre destiny, to get an answer to the question that haunted him. Why me? And in his profound naivety, he began to believe that the chemical state induced by the pills could bring him closer to that answer. He thought he could force an epiphany. He was trying to use a pharmaceutical sledgehammer to break down the doors of perception. These weren't just nights of hedonistic excess. They were sessions, frantic searches for meaning in a chemical fog. He would talk for hours, deep into the false dawn, about cosmic consciousness, and his connection to his deceased twin brother, Jesse. The drugs didn't just numb him. They opened a Pandora's box of paranoia and manic spiritualism. He was becoming a king in a kingdom of ghosts, convinced he was receiving messages from another plane of existence. The tragedy is that he was looking for purity in the most impure of places. What was he so desperate to understand? What was the secret pain so deep that he thought the only way to heal it was to leave his own mind entirely? The answer, it seems, wasn't just about leaving his own mind, but in attempting to perfectly mold another. Because into this chemical kingdom of paranoia and sleepless searching, Elvis was about to bring a child. Was this a desperate search for love, or the ultimate act of control? Priscilla was his immaculate creation, a living doll in his private kingdom, to be dressed, educated, and molded in his own image. He was shielding her from the world, yet trapping her in his nocturnal, chemically fueled reality. He dictated her hair color, her clothes, her posture. It was the ultimate act of control from a man who was losing control of everything else. He was building a perfect miniature world with one perfect subject, while his own vast empire crumbled from the inside out. And then, for one dazzling, electric moment, the real Elvis returned. 1968. The comeback special. He shed the silly costumes and the frothy scripts. Clad in black leather, dripping with sweat and raw charisma, he wasn't playing a character. He was the man the world had fallen in love with. Dangerous, vital, and utterly magnetic. It was a roar of defiance, a reminder of the lightning he held inside him. He was back on the throne, but every throne is also a cage. The victory of the comeback special led directly to the gilded prison of Las Vegas. The white, rhinestone-studded jumpsuit became his uniform. Night after night, 2 shows a night, he was the king, the main attraction, the god in the temple of excess. The crowd saw a legend. They didn't see the punishing schedule, the cocktail of narcotics needed to get him on stage, and the sedatives required to get him off. The stage grew smaller. The world outside it vanished. Graceland became a tomb, and Vegas was a mausoleum where he was buried alive, night after night. The fantasy couldn't hold. The perfect doll he had created grew up. Priscilla, no longer a child, could not live in the twilight with him. When she left, the final wall of his fortress collapsed. He was now truly alone, adrift in the Graceland mansion with his ghosts, his spiritual books, and his ever-present pharmacy. The spiritual quest had soured into incoherent, rambling monologues. The search for God had ended in a swamp of paranoia and delusion. He was surrounded by people, but his isolation was absolute. The final act was a tragedy played out in public. The sleek, dangerous animal of 68 was gone, replaced by a bloated, stumbling caricature. He forgot the words to the songs that had made him immortal. He mumbled incoherently to audiences who still screamed his name, either out of loyalty or denial. The man who had electrified the world, whose every move was a jolt of pure energy, could barely stand. It was the slow, quiet, public death of a demigod. In the end, after all the noise, the screaming, the flashbulbs, and the myth-making, he died quietly and alone. The king was found, not on a throne, but on the floor of his bathroom. A profoundly human and mundane end for a man who became a deity. He was a prisoner of his own fame, a victim of his own needs, a boy from Tupelo who flew too close to the sun and never found his way back to Earth. The question he spent his life asking, "Why me?" is the one we are left with. A story of talent, temptation, and tragedy that is, in the end, the story of us all, amplified to the level of myth. The story is never really over. It lives on in every note, every photograph, every legend. To make sure you don't miss a single part of this incredible journey, subscribe to Forever_Elvis_Stories. The king is gone, but his story is forever.